The following is an HDNet original presentation.
Tonight, NASA's grounding its space shuttle program, and a new space race is taking off. Dan Rather sits down with a distinguished panel of experts to discuss America's future in the stars.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, liftoff of Space Shuttle Atlantis.
Good evening. Tonight, our program travels farther than it ever has with a special roundtable discussion about the future of space exploration. While our conversation will take us up into the cosmos, we'll be grounded here on Earth at the Lyndon B. Johnson Space Center, NASA's Center for Human Spaceflight Training, Research, and Flight Control, located in Houston, Texas. Our panel includes some top experts on the U.S. space program, including 3 who have had the rare opportunity to see our home planet from above.
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now.
The United States has long been a leader in space exploration, and this has been a source of immense national pride and identity. Astronauts are our heroes, and the space program the embodiment of American ingenuity and our ability to make lofty dreams a reality. But since the moon landing more than 40 years ago, American accomplishments in space have been more subtle, and for decades now, the American space program has failed to capture the public's imagination. Federal priorities have gone elsewhere. And now, after 135 launches, the iconic Space Shuttle program is coming to an end. In fact, just behind me, a shuttle the astronauts use for training is already being dismantled. America's space program is entering a new era, one of both uncertainty and promise. We've been hearing for years about a mission to Mars that would reignite public excitement and reassert American leadership in space. But with Washington in disagreement over NASA's next step, these ambitious plans have struggled to get off the ground, and a successor to the shuttle appears to be years away. Meanwhile, a private sector space race is underway. NASA has given tens of millions of dollars in development funds and billions in contracts to commercial space ventures in hopes that these for-profit companies can fill the gap left by the shuttle. But can competition among private businesses fuel innovation the way Cold War rivalries once did? We're coming to you tonight from the Blastoff Theater at Space Center, Houston. We have assembled a distinguished panel for what we hope will be a lively conversation about a topic all of these men feel passionately about. Walter Cunningham is one of the pioneers of space exploration. In October 1968, he lifted off on the first manned flight of the Apollo program, Apollo 7.
Good morning to everyone in television land. You're looking at the main display console.
While in orbit, Cunningham and his fellow crew members sent home these grainy black and white images, the first live TV broadcast from space. More than 40 years after Apollo 7 splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, Cunningham is calling for a return to the lofty goals of those early days of space exploration. And while he has consulted for the private space industry, he firmly believes the effort should be government-led.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the International Space Station. I'm Expedition 10 Commander Leroy Chow.
Leroy Chow is a veteran of 3 shuttle flights, and he lived aboard the International Space Station for more than 6 months. Over the course of his career, Chow has worked closely with astronauts from many countries, and he is a strong supporter of international cooperation in space. Now he's a senior executive at an international space company called Excalibur Almaz Limited. Ken Bowersox was a NASA astronaut for 19 years and logged more than 200 days in space. including 5 consecutive months aboard the International Space Station. Now he's applying that wealth of experience to the private sector as Vice President of Astronaut Safety and Mission Assurance at a company called SpaceX. In December of last year, SpaceX became the first commercial entity to do what only governments had done before, sending a spacecraft into orbit and returning it safely to Earth. SpaceX already has a $1.6 billion contract with NASA to transport cargo to the space station, and the company says its Dragon spacecraft can be ready to carry people into orbit within 3 years. And finally, Bobby Braun. He is the chief technologist at NASA and professor of space technology at the Georgia Institute of Technology. During his 20-year career, Braun has led the design of pioneering robotic probes, like the famous Mars Pathfinder, which sent back vital scientific data and thousands of stunning images from Mars. As a NASA insider, Braun says the U.S. government will continue to be a leader in space, even as private enterprise takes a bigger role.
Well, welcome all. Let's get started. Dr. Chow, where are we now?
Well, we are in a state of transition because, as you know, the last shuttle flight, the flight of Atlantis, will mark the end of the space shuttle program, a very successful 30-year program. And from that point on, until we get some of these commercial efforts going, the United States will have no independent way of getting our own astronauts into space. So by definition, we will be ceding the leadership of human spaceflight, at least temporarily.
Temporarily means what? About a 5-year period?
I would say at least 5 years, and probably longer, maybe at least 7 years.
With the space shuttle ending, fair or unfair to say that the Russians become the leading space exploration country in the world?
I wouldn't say that, actually. We're in a partnership, it's an international partnership with the Russians and other countries right now. We're all working together on the International Space Station. On the space station, the Russians are as dependent on us as we are upon them. It's a true collaboration. Now, in these next few years, it's true that we'll be launching American astronauts on Russian vehicles. But where else in the world, but in the United States of America, would we be so bold, but to say our industry is capable of doing something that only government powers have done in the past? That, to me, that's a true testament of this country's will and strength.
But is that true? Is American private industry and capital capable of keeping up with what needs to be done in the exploration of space, in which the Russians, the Chinese, the Japanese, and many others, Europeans, are now engaged?
Well, I think American free enterprise is tremendously capable. Just look at our company, SpaceX. We've already launched our private spacecraft into Earth orbit. We've flown it a lap and a half around the Earth. We've entered it successfully into the atmosphere and recovered it. I believe in the next 3 years, and roughly that period, we'll be able to launch astronauts on our vehicle, the Dragon.
Well, there are similarities and differences in what's going on now. Private companies, private enterprise has built all of our spacecraft. The difference today is we're emphasizing commercial space ventures. I don't truly see it as commercial. There are companies that would not even be able to be in business were it not for being subsidized by government contract. I do not know of anything in space where private enterprise can put their money in and expect to get a return on it sometime in the future. So without a government contract, I don't think it's going to make it.
What about Mr. Cunningham's argument, Mr. Sox, whether private enterprise alone or even with substantial government help can do it?
Well, there's a lot of lessons that people talk about, a lot of lessons from history. The one that seems to be most applicable to the current situation with private human spaceflight is the example of the airmail industry. In the very early days, the government was the chief contractor for that service. True. And it wasn't real profitable. The companies wouldn't have made any money without the government. Now we've got companies like FedEx and UPS. Now that took 70 years, but it started with government contracts. The thing that those early airmail folks had as an advantage, and the things that we will have an advantage as a private company, is that we can bring in additional revenue in addition to the government revenue, and we can apply that towards future development of systems, future exploration. We can do charges for advertising. We could potentially fly paying passengers. We don't have to make all of our profit on that private activity. We can just make a little bit that can be leveraged along with the government funds, and then that will grow over time.
Well, the analogy with aviation, the early days of aviation, I don't think is necessarily a really good one in this case, because of those days. You talk about mail, of course. If you wanted to communicate from New York to Los Angeles to California, it was by ship. Then we got the Pony Express, and well, we got the telegraph. And so everybody was trying to shorten that time, which was a huge amount of time. So it was a demand to speed that up. The difference now, I think, with our commercial space companies is they're having to create the market. They're going to have to create that marketplace. Hopefully, they can do that, but it's not a fixed, obvious thing. Commercial enterprises are there to make money, not for exploration. The only entities that can ever afford exploring our whole universe out here is government entities, and that's why you see, you know, Russia, China, India, the United States. So I think that aspect of it is what's going to be suffering the most as we go forward, is the spirit of exploration that has so many benefits because you're facing real obstacles and having to overcome them with your new solutions, and those new solutions, that technology feeds out into our commercial area. That's going to be missing.
Explain something. I want to make sure our audience understands. You will be in low orbit, right? That's where you and your company hope to make their money.
Right. To start with, I mean, the beginning of our business is in low Earth orbit.
And lower orbit would be considered below what?
Within a few hundred miles of Earth. So that close zone just above the atmosphere is where we want to start our business. But our goal is to go farther than that. We want to enable exploration beyond the moon, beyond Mars. The head of our company talks about going to Mars. I'm focused further out. I would like to see us go to the nearest star someday. But to do that, we need certain elements. We have to be able to get people in and out of the atmosphere, off the surface of the planet. We have to be able to get them from low Earth orbit on out to those distant destinations. We have to get cargo into space that they can work with. It's difficult for us to agree on the destination, but I think the elements for all the destinations are common, and that's why we're working on those elements right now.
More of our discussion on the future of the space program when we return. So stay here with us.
This is Taurus. Constructed almost entirely from ore mined on the moon, the Taurus colony would become home for 10,000 people.
Ever since the end of the moon program more than 3 decades ago, Americans have wondered what the next giant leap might be.
Space colonization, beneficial occupancy of possibly the last and highest frontier.
NASA's archives are filled with artists' renditions of future exploration programs that were never to be. Everything from moon bases to Mars missions to mining operations on an asteroid. Few doubt that these lofty dreams can someday be realized. The question is whether we're willing to pay for it.
It is time for America to take the next steps. Today I announce a new plan to explore space and extend a human presence across our solar system.
In 2004, President Bush set the goal of returning to the moon by 2020 and a mission to Mars after that. But a few years later, a panel of independent space experts known as the Augustine Committee determined that without billions more in yearly funding, it couldn't be done.
The human spaceflight program that the United States is currently pursuing is on an unsustainable trajectory.
So President Obama canceled Bush's program and instead proposed landing humans on an asteroid by 2025. But earlier this year, a series of reports from NASA suggested that even this new plan was having trouble launching. The reason was the same: not enough money. In light of all this uncertainty, we ask our roundtable what America's next destination in space should be and whether the trip is worth the cost.
What can we do, what should we do as a people, as a society, as a country that would be meaningful? What's the next meaningful thing? Reaching the moon meant something. We now talk about going to Mars, but correct me if I'm wrong, the best estimates are Mars maybe by 2030, 2035 at the earliest. What national goal that would be meaningful can we set and should we set?
I personally am a Mars guy. I've spent most of my career working on sending robotic probes to Mars, and I believe that in my lifetime we will send humans to Mars. Is that the next step? I don't actually think so. I think that we'll take an intermediate step, and whether that intermediate step is going back to the moon for a longer period of time or going out into deep space beyond the Earth's gravitational attraction to a place we've never been before, like an asteroid, I think that remains to be seen. What we're developing right now, though, are the basic capabilities, the building blocks that we need to go to either of those destinations. We need a larger launch vehicle, and we're working on that. We need a deep space capable capsule that can keep our crews safe in space for long periods of time. NASA's working on that.
President Obama has changed our goal from what was the goal when he came into office. It was, we're going to go back to the moon. He says, in fact, listen, we've done that, and he's shifted the policy. Based on your experience and your own personal opinion, should we go back to the moon as a way of going to Mars, or concentrate on next step Mars?
Well, it's interesting when you look at those from my generation. There's a real split between those who think we return to the moon or don't return to the moon. I'm like, right here. I want to go to Mars. In 1971, I sat on a panel where we were trying to arrive at the next objective for NASA. It turned out to be the shuttle, but there were several other things being considered. One was a trip to Mars, and the time frame they were talking about was 1986. Now, we can look back and say that, well, we know that 1986 would have been ridiculous, but there's not a one of us that was in the astronaut office in those days that would not have bet that we would have been to Mars by the year 2000. And that was because we didn't take into account the falling off of all the money. The reason that we won the space race is because we were spending, like, the max was 4% of the federal budget of those days. Today we're talking about 0.4%. We cannot even return to the moon if we keep a budget that stays this low.
Yeah, if I can jump in here, Dan. You know, when I was working with the Augustine Committee, we were looking at different options. Everyone agreed that Mars was kind of the big next goal out there. The problem was, and you'll remember when President Bush 41 announced plans to go to Mars, he said he wanted to go by 2019. And back in 1989, that was an awful long time away, and nobody really, you know, so far away that people lost interest. Well, to do it more quickly, the estimates that came back cost-wise during our work on the committee were so large that it was not credible to present, and we would just lose credibility as a committee. And so the idea was to build up your, you know, not set a date to get to Mars, but set intermediate destinations that would be interesting, like a near-Earth object, like a small base, not a permanent base on the moon, but a small man-tended base where you could test your hardware and operations.
There's been some talk of trying to go to an asteroid. Mars, our ultimate target, put a human on Mars, but in the meantime, focus on going to an asteroid. What do you think of that?
I think it'd be incredibly exciting.
Be exciting, but would it be worthwhile? Would it be meaningful?
There are a number of reasons for going to an asteroid. First of all, just having humans go out beyond the confines of the Earth's gravitational well, out into deep space for the first time, would be a historic achievement.
Absolutely. I agree with Bobby. It's a great intermediate destination. You know, it's something that can be within the attention span of the people. You know, within 10 years or so, we could probably go to an asteroid. We could go visit it. Before we go to Mars, we have to understand and figure out how to keep people healthy in deep space or relatively deep space for, you know, 6 months to a year or even longer, because once you're away from low Earth orbit, you're away from the protective Van Allen radiation belts that trap all the charged particles, and you're exposed to a lot more radiation, especially if you have a solar flare. And, Walt can tell you during the Apollo days, that's one thing they really worried about going to the moon, was being exposed to the possibility of a large solar flare killing the crew with acute radiation. So a lot of reasons to go to intermediate destinations beyond low Earth orbit.
It doesn't quite have the ring to it, go to an asteroid, like let's go to Mars.
Well, I call that kind of a Mars-light philosophy. It's the people that don't want to really bite off a commitment to go to Mars. Not that there aren't some scientific returns that you can get, from visiting an asteroid, and some operational techniques, perhaps, as well, too.
What about the argument that says, listen, we've been so fixed on putting humans on a far star, on the moon, onto Mars, that where we in the United States should go, not give up manned space flight, but say our concentration will be on exploring with automatons, with robots, with our deep. In other words, why stay in the manned space business?
Mm-hmm. Well, we actually do that now. We do explore the solar system robotically. We've had probes that have landed on every planet. They tend to be small and focused experiments. They tend to be pre-planned experiments. And so one of the benefits of having a human in the system is to make real-time decisions. Steve Squires, who was the principal investigator of the Mars exploration rovers, those 2 rovers on Mars that have been traveling around the planet for over 5 years and been so successful, he said that if we had a human geologist on the surface of Mars, that human could do all the science that those rovers did in 5 years. It could do in just a day, just by making decisions of which rock to pick up and what experiment to apply to that rock in real time. So I think in the future what we're looking at is not is it human exploration or is it robotic exploration, it's what will humans and robotics do together to benefit us here on the Earth.
Again, for the person in the living room who's saying to himself, listen, I love what we've accomplished in space. It should be and is a matter of national pride. But we have so many needs here. We're looking at debt that scares us, wars overseas. We have a lot of poor people, a lot of poverty in the country. We just can't afford to do the kinds of things that Dan Rather and these distinguished gentlemen have been talking about. To that person, you would say what?
The short answer would be I'd say you can't afford not to do what we're doing, to explore. To go into the longer part of that, I'd say we are devoting a lot of resources to those very important problems that you talked about. But as a country, to grow, we need to focus beyond those problems. And space exploration is one place where we can unite our efforts, combine resources with other countries, and do great things that pull us out of the everyday problems that are so difficult. When I was in the Navy, I trained to drop weapons on other countries, among them the former Soviet Union, defensive only, but if we ever got to that situation, that was going to be my job. I flew with a guy named Nikolai Budarin. He was the commander of our Soyuz spacecraft. He trained in the 70s and 80s to shoot down airplanes like mine. I think it's a whole lot better having us work together than it is to have us spending money on resources on how to fight each other. And I think we can build that cooperation in these international efforts. We'll have a whole lot more money to devote to all the problems that you mentioned.
I'd like to follow on to what Ken said. One thing that a lot of people don't realize is we spend, as a nation, we spend half a penny of every federal dollar on NASA. It's not a large amount. But from that half a cent on the dollar, we get all of NASA's science missions, all of NASA's human spaceflight missions, all of NASA's advances in aeronautics that make air travel safer for the public, the protective armor that keeps our police, firefighters, and military personnel safe. The last point I want to make on that is that all of NASA's dollars are spent right here in the United States. They're not spent up in space. They're spent on American jobs, high-tech American jobs that are economically viable and economically valuable for this country.
But let's talk about politics and cost. You've been in this game for a long time. Politics is always, if not right at the surface of our national thinking about this, just below. Let's talk about the politics of exploration of space.
Well, there's no question that politics right now is maybe the strongest player in just going into space, even if it's just low Earth orbit. Back in the 1960s, and even the early 70s there, the politics was big picture politics. It's now down to nitpicking politics. We now try to justify some of these targets and things you want to do by which congressman or which senator is going to support it, and to do that, we better make sure that he's got some facility out there in his district that benefits from it. So I think politics has almost taken over. I think it's the driver now on there. So I do not look for us to having near as clear or accomplishable goals with politics playing the role it is now.
I think the reality is politics drives everything we do, whether it's spaceflight or anything else. And that's not a good thing or a bad thing, that's just reality. And the reason that countries get into human spaceflight is for national prestige. I mean, there are all kinds of benefits from that kind of spending, from the technology spin-offs to the drivers to the intangibles like inspiring the young people of the next generation, which is critically important. But the fact remains, it's political. It's for national prestige. That's why we got into it to counter the Russians, and that's why we got into this space race, so-called space race, that ended with us landing people on the moon first. That's why you see China rising as a spacefaring power in human spaceflight. Even countries like India have announced intentions to do so, and so we should be the leaders of that international exploration effort.
Let me interject. You visited the Chinese space facility, did you not?
Right.
Well, where are the Chinese? Should we consider them the competitor of the future?
Well, the Chinese, in 2006, I was the first American to be allowed to go visit their space center in Beijing, their astronaut center, and got a chance to look at some of their training facilities and some of their hardware. And I would say I'm very impressed with their technological level. They've clearly taken advantage of knowledge that has been gained over the years from primarily the former Soviet Union and Russia, but they've modernized everything. Now, what they lack is operational experience. They've only flown 3 times, and their longest flight was 5 days. They've done one spacewalk, which lasted all of about 16, 17 minutes, as opposed to our spacewalks, which last 6.5 hours doing major construction on the ISS. I remember a few years ago, we had a delegation of Chinese specialists here, including the director of the center, visit the Johnson Space Center. And we went into the Mission Control Center, and we went into the Shuttle Control Center where they were doing real-time EVA repair of the Hubble Space Telescope. So right on the big screen, you've got astronauts, U.S. astronauts repairing the Hubble. Then we went down to the next control room, to the International Space Station, and with real-time images of operations aboard the ISS. These guys were blown away. We were so far ahead of them in operations. They couldn't believe we're handling all these operations in space simultaneously and making it look easy.
Our roundtable discussion on space flight and the future of space flight continues. So don't go away. Last week marked the end of an era when the final U.S. space Shuttle Atlantis, lifted off on a cloudy day in Cape Canaveral, Florida. It's the grand finale of a 30-year program that introduced the most sophisticated flying machines in the world. An estimated 1 million spectators gathered to cheer the shuttle's last mission to the International Space Station, where it is delivering a year's supply of clothes, food, and equipment. But when Atlantis touches back to Earth next week and the shuttle program officially ends, the United States will no longer have a vehicle of its own to launch astronauts into space. Private companies like SpaceX are gearing up to fill that void, but until they're ready, space experts are calling this time the gap, and our astronauts will have to hitch a ride with someone else.
The space shuttle is finished as of this summer. How do our astronauts get into space? Strictly with the Russians?
For the foreseeable future, NASA astronauts will be riding on the Russian Soyuz spacecraft until we have another U.S. vehicle ready to take them into space.
Let me get this straight. And I and every other American taxpayer paying for that, it takes what, $50 million for an astronaut into orbit with the Russians?
I think it's up to 63.
It's up to 60-some million now, yeah.
$63 million. Question to you, can SpaceX do it for less?
Well, our target is $20 million a seat. That's if we can get 7 people inside the vehicle and figuring about $140 million per launch. That's what we've advertised to everybody. So we still have a 300% growth margin before we catch up with the Russians. So we have a lot of room, even if we're wrong at 20 million. And we think it's possible. And a lot of people ask, well, how are you going to do that? How are you going to make your vehicle the safest, most reliable, and economical spacecraft? And I would say there's a lot of examples around us, but let's just talk one. Let's look at, say, a GM Cruise or any economy car and compare it to a Ferrari. You know, the Ferrari may cost about 10 times as much, but would you say it's safer? I wouldn't. The difference is that Ferrari's got really cool paint, you know, it's got a leather interior, and it goes 200 miles an hour on the freeway. Do you need to do that? No, the economy car gives you good gas mileage, it goes the speed you need, and you can get it for a lot less money. The difference is in excess performance. We're going to be trimming that excess performance out of our vehicle, making sure that it gets people up and down safely, but it's not designed to do a lot more than that, and that's going to save money.
Yeah, but which car do you want?
Everybody wants the Ferrari. That's the problem. Everybody wants the Ferrari. That's why space travel ends up being so expensive.
All you can do is guess, or make an educated guess. How long before Americans of average income are going to be able to go into space flight? I mean, right now, if I have $20 million, if I understand it, I can get on your list to go, right? But how long before people making $50,000 or $100,000 a year are going to be able to afford a ticket?
If you just look at the cost of the fuel to get people into space, I think it's going to be a long time before just your average, everyday person is going to get a ride into space like they would buy an airline ticket.
Dan, I would say that it's going to take a technological breakthrough before we can get the ticket prices, if you will, down significantly. I should say the seat prices, because the main, by far, the main expense of a space flight is the rocket launcher. And it's just not going to get a lot cheaper. The technology's mature. We know how to build rocket engines. As Ken said, the fuel's expensive, but the vehicle, building that vehicle repeatedly and reliably, rocket engines, high-pressure turbopumps, that's what drives your cost. If you're a satellite provider, you're paying about $100 million to launch your satellite into space.
I think the first step there will be the general public flying on suborbital flights into space. And there are a number of companies that are planning to offer that service to the American public for a much lower price in the next year or two.
That's just go up and come down, not orbit.
Just touching space. Right?
Just
touching space and
reach the altitude of space, spend many minutes in the microgravity environment, see what it's like. It's really, they call it space tourism. It's part of space tourism. But it's a step towards orbital flights, which are a step towards even beyond.
Let me, in the time we have remaining, I'm going to go all the way, beginning with, what question have I not asked you that I should have asked you?
Well, one thing that I'd like to touch on real quick is you know, what I think was so exciting about the 1960s and the Apollo program, at least, you know, I wasn't a part of it, but from reading about it, was that we were actually flying spacecraft. Let's say we were flying the Mercury, while we were flying the Mercury astronauts, we were testing the systems and the capabilities for the Gemini spacecraft, and on blackboards around the country we were designing the Apollo systems. We had a series of spacecraft in progression, in rapid progression, and that got engineers and scientists and the general public in this country really engaged in the space program. When, you know, in this past decade, we haven't done that, right? So we're retiring the space shuttle this year. That's not the defining moment in human spaceflight. It's the decision that was made maybe a decade ago to not design and test and build the spacecraft to replace the shuttle. You know, that decision was made previously, so that vehicle would be ready today. When I think about the future, where we're headed, we're going back to that Apollo-like mode. We have the International Space Station that's flying, it's in operations. We're working with American industry to get spacecraft back into space, and then NASA is designing on whiteboards today instead of blackboards, but on whiteboards today and in our computers, we're designing the deep space systems, the vehicles that are going to take astronauts out into space beyond low Earth orbit. We're in the middle of this bittersweet time where we are saying goodbye to this engineering marvel, the space shuttle, that's been so good to this country for 30 years. But what we're moving into is a bright future.
There is great uncertainty right now, and I think it's unquestionable that we are going to take a dip in prestige, the United States that is, but there is great potential for us to, come out of this chaos, if you will, and re-emerge as the leaders in human spaceflight. I think there are great opportunities internationally. I mean, let's go engage China constructively as we did with Russia. That way we can have multiple paths to the space station and use that as a framework to go do international exploration with the United States in the lead.
I'll come to you, Mr. Cunningham, my question. What question have I asked you that I should have asked you?
That's a bad question to ask me. There's a number of things that I think we could cover, but let me just focus on maybe some positives here. What can we learn from, like, the Russians and the Chinese? We're not talking about what can we learn about from the Indian space program yet, but I mean, they're pretty aggressive also. Well, let's just take the Russians, for example. They're flying the same vehicle with upgrades. They've been flying the same one for the last 40 years. They evolve their stuff. I don't think that their technical capability or their operational capability is near as good as ours. But they have stuck to what they're doing. We built the Apollo spacecraft, we threw the hardware away. We built the space shuttle, we're throwing the space shuttle away. There's any number of things that we've spent money on. It's a start, stop, what have you. The Russians have evolved. We should be evolving our programs. Personally, I would not be throwing away the space shuttle, because the things that are the shortcomings, principally the maintenance and the refurbishment or what have you, we could be using technology to improve that and shorten that and therefore making it cheaper. Look at the Chinese. They started their manned spaceflight program, what, 71, 72? Nobody even knew about it. They are able to make commitments on the long-term basis. They can fund for a couple of years. We don't know what the funding is next year or the next president. I mean, if we could learn to evolve our hardware instead of make it and throw it away, if we could find some way of making long-term commitments for spaceflight, those would be benefits that we could learn from others.
What I wish you'd ask me is, why do I think space exploration is important? Why do I spend so much time in my life working on something like exploring space? And what I'd tell you is it's about the future. It's about the future of our kids. It's about the future of all of humanity. 3,000 years from now, I think we're going to have people living on a planet that's orbiting another star. And they're going to look back at what we did now. And all these things that seem so big to us, all these big arguments, are going to seem very small. And they're going to say, those guys laid the building blocks that allowed us to reach this planet and to colonize. And it's exciting to me to be part of that.
Well, on that note, I thank you all for being here. Thank you for taking the time. We admire what you've already accomplished, and we dream about what you and others will accomplish in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you.
Up next, JFK's decision to go to the moon. There's more to the story than you might know, so stick around. Welcome back. As we talk about the future of space exploration, it's important to remember the excitement and the importance of the early days. Some 50 years ago, during the height of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in the famous space race. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy upped the ante when he announced the United States would, quote, catch up to and overtake the Soviet Union by sending astronauts to the moon.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
It's become a moment
for our history textbooks, but there's a lot more to the story. Space historian John Logsdon recently wrote the book John F. Kennedy and the Race to the Moon. Dr. Logsdon, thank you for sitting with us today. How did the exploration of space begin?
Well, it's been a dream of people for centuries, but the dream is only a dream until it gets linked to resources and government resources. So it was both the United States and the Soviet Union in the 1950s that saw with the development of rocket technology it would be possible to put objects in orbit and rather quickly to put humans in orbit.
Today, a new moon is in the sky.
In 57 with Sputnik, 58 the United States created NASA, announced very quickly Project Mercury. The Soviet Union launched a dog and was clearly on the path to put people in space. So the program had lots of momentum in these early years, with it being part of the kind of zero-sum Cold War competition between the two societies.
I remember very well as a younger man in the 1950s, what a shock, what an absolute shock it was to the American psyche when the Soviets were the first to put an object in orbit. True or untrue that President Eisenhower himself was shocked when the Soviets put it up?
I believe so. I mean, he didn't really, I think, appreciate its significance. Even the private papers of Eisenhower suggest that being in space wasn't that big a deal. What he was worried about was the rocket capability in terms of an intercontinental missile.
Now let's move to the presidency of John Kennedy. He's elected in 1960. He takes office in 1961. Among the first things he does is commit us to the space race.
Well, but not the very first. In fact, in his inaugural address, he had said to the Soviet Union, let us explore the stars together.
Let both sides seek to invoke the wonders of science instead of its terrors. Together, let us explore the stars, conquer the deserts, eradicate disease.
I think one of the things that has faded in memory because it doesn't fit the master narrative is that Kennedy, from the start, would have preferred to cooperate. 10 days after announcing his decision to go to the moon, the one and only time he met face-to-face with Nikita Khrushchev at a summit meeting in Vienna, he said to Khrushchev, why don't we go to the moon together?
And Khrushchev said what?
Khrushchev said no, because it would reveal too much of our military relevant technology. And then at his end of his life, Kennedy went before the General Assembly of the UN, September of 1963, and proposed once again in a very public way, let's do it together.
I include among these possibilities a joint expedition to the moon. Why should man's first flight to the moon be a matter of national competition?
Now, the John F. Kennedy Library recently released some audio tapes of John F. Kennedy discussing the space program with the then NASA Administrator, Mr. James Webb. What was revealed from those JFK Webb audio tapes?
Well, it was kind of the low point of Kennedy's enthusiasm for the program. He was worried about his commitment to Apollo becoming a liability as he ran for re-election in 1964. And so he said, you know, how are we going to maintain support for this program, and implicitly, how are we going to protect me, John Kennedy, from attacks on the program, which had risen in intensity in '63. And his conclusion was to give it a military justification.
Right now, I don't think the space program has much political irony. I think this is a real problem. This looks like a hell of a lot of dough to go to the moon when you can learn most of what you want scientifically through instruments. We got to wrap around a military use for what we're doing and spending in space. Because if we don't, it does look like a stunt and too much money. Right. I think it's the only way we're going to be able to spend it before the public in the next 12 months.
If John F. Kennedy had not been assassinated, what do you think would have happened to the space program?
Well, I suspect that somewhere along the line he would have maybe slowed the program down a bit, relieved the end of the decade deadline, But I think he was committed to seeing the program through. I don't think he was ready to walk away. The day before he was killed, he made a speech in San Antonio, a beautiful speech. He talked about the Irish writer Frank Connor writing about kids going across the countryside, and when they got to a wall that was too high to climb, they threw their caps over the wall, so they had to go on.
This nation has tossed its cap over the wall of space, and we have no choice but to follow it.
President Kennedy is assassinated in 1963. Lyndon Johnson becomes president. Let's assess the Johnson presidency in the space program.
Well, with the assassination of Kennedy, Apollo became kind of a memorial to a young president and essentially uncancelable. So Lyndon Johnson provided the resources to get Apollo finished, but did not provide the resources for any follow-on program. So NASA got to 69, got to the first landing on the moon without any clear sense of what once you've been to the moon, then what?
That brings us to the presidency of Richard Nixon. We land on the moon, then what?
Well, Nixon said, I don't want to put money in space. I'm trying to reduce the federal budget overall. Space is associated with John Kennedy. There's nothing that could be done in my presidency that would bring lots of attention to me. And so he said, give me the cheapest program that will give NASA something to do and keep us going. And the answer to that was Space Shuttle.
Critical decision, because there was, if not a national consensus, something near a national consensus. We've landed on the moon, on to Mars.
Well, there were certainly a lot of discussion of that, and I think the foundation had been laid for it. Plus, we had the equipment. We had the huge Saturn V rocket, which now we're 40 years later recreating for a deep space program. Nixon just was not interested in the next big thing in space. He got recommendations and very quickly squelched those recommendations to build a big space station, have a transportation system for the space station, which was a shuttle, lunar bases, and then Mars sometime in the 80s. And he said, no, I'm not interested.
Let's talk about the here and now. Are we still the leader in space exploration?
Well, we're spending on space in the United States more money than the rest of the world's countries combined. So we should be a leader spending that much resources. I mean, it is embarrassing to not have our own system for carrying astronauts to the station, but it's only a taxi service. It's not a big deal, and as long as we are working on replacing the shuttle with some simpler system, I think it's acceptable. I mean, people miss the point that we are, if you want, 75% owner of the space station, and we're going to be up there doing physics, chemistry, biology, engineering research with our people for the next 10 years. So the United States is going to be active in space. So I say, yes, we are still in a leadership position, and the only way to lose it is by standing still. I think the end of the shuttle program is an opportunity for President Obama to say something about the future and where we're going and dispel some of this uncertainty and pessimism that's unfortunately rather pervasive right now. It's a choice we have to make of whether we have a good future or not. If all we do is station with nothing to follow, then others will explore and we won't, or we'll be passengers on their deep space spacecraft. That would be, to me, a tragic, unfortunate outcome, but it's possible.
But we get to choose.
Well, we should, but it's a leadership decision. I think we've been lacking a bit the leadership that articulates a long-term, good, compelling vision for space exploration.
Doctor, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
For decades, the United States has been the unquestioned leader in space. But remember that it's been more than 40 years since Neil Armstrong took those first famous small steps on the moon.
By that measure, our exploration of the stars is not nearly as far along as many thought it would be by now. And with the end of the shuttle, our next step is anything but clear. Will commercial companies fuel another giant leap? Will countries like China take the lead? Will America's ambitions in space be matched by our commitment of both the time and the money it will take to achieve them? We've heard a variety of different perspectives tonight, and our guests have expressed both optimism and concern. In many ways, the future of America's journey in space is as uncertain today as it was half a century ago when President Kennedy proposed the then almost unthinkable goal of a journey to the moon. And that's our program for tonight. For HDNet, from the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Dan Rather reporting. Good night.
If you would like to add your name to an email list for information on upcoming programs, or if you would just like to send a question or comment, please email us at viewer@hd.net. Chache was a NASA astronaut for 19 years and logged more than 200 days in space, including 5 consecutive months aboard the International Space Station. Now, he's applying that wealth of experience to the private sector as Vice President of Astronaut Safety and Mission Assurance at a company called SpaceX. In December of last year, SpaceX became the first commercial entity to do what only governments had done before, sending a spacecraft into orbit and returning it safely to Earth. SpaceX already has a $1.6 billion contract with NASA to transport cargo to the space station, and the company says its Dragon spacecraft can be ready to carry people into orbit within 3 years. And finally, Bobby Braun. He is the chief technologist at NASA and professor of space technology at the Georgia Institute of Technology. During his 20-year career, Braun has led the design of pioneering robotic probes, like the famous Mars Pathfinder, which sent back vital scientific data and thousands of stunning images from Mars. As a NASA insider, Braun's
The following is an HDNet original presentation.
Tonight, NASA's grounding its space shuttle program, and a new space race is taking off. Dan Rather sits down with a distinguished panel of experts to discuss America's future in the stars.
T-minus 10, 9, 8. Liftoff of Space Shuttle Atlantis.
Good evening. Tonight, our program travels farther than it ever has with a special roundtable discussion about the future of space exploration. While our conversation will take us up into the cosmos, we'll be grounded here on Earth at the Lyndon B. Johnson Space Center, NASA's Center for Human Spaceflight Training, Research, and Flight Control, located in Houston, Texas.
He lifted off on the first manned flight of the Apollo program, Apollo 7.
Good morning to everyone in television land. You're looking at the main display console.
While in orbit, Cunningham and his fellow crew members sent home these grainy black and white images, the first live TV broadcast from space. More than 40 years after Apollo 7 splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, Cunningham is calling for a return to the lofty goals of those early days of space exploration. And while he has consulted for the private space industry, he firmly believes the effort should be government-led.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the International Space Station. I'm Expedition 10 Commander Leroy Chache.
Leroy Chache is a veteran of 3 shuttle flights, and he lived aboard the International Space Station for more than 6 months. Over the course of his career, Chache has worked closely with astronauts from many countries, and he is a strong supporter of international cooperation in space. Now he's a senior executive at an international space company called Excalibur Almaz Limited. Ken Bowers has been hearing for years about a mission to Mars that would reignite public excitement and reassert American leadership in space. But with Washington in disagreement over NASA's next step, these ambitious plans have struggled to get off the ground, and a successor to the shuttle appears to be years away. Meanwhile, a private sector space race is underway. NASA has given tens of millions of dollars in development funds and billions in contracts to commercial space ventures in hopes that these for-profit companies can fill the gap left by the shuttle. But can competition among private businesses fuel innovation the way Cold War rivalries once did? We're coming to you tonight from the Blastoff Theater at Space Center, Houston. We have assembled a distinguished panel for what we hope will be a lively conversation about a topic all of these men feel passionately about. Walter Cunningham is one of the pioneers of space exploration. In October 1968, our panel includes some top experts on the U.S. space program, including 3 who have had the rare opportunity to see our home planet from above.
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now.
The United States has long been a leader in space exploration, and this has been a source of immense national pride and identity. Astronauts are our heroes, and the space program the embodiment of American ingenuity and our ability to make lofty dreams a reality. But since the moon landing more than 40 years ago, American accomplishments in space have been more subtle, and for decades now, the American space program has failed to capture the public's imagination. Federal priorities have gone elsewhere. And now, after 135 launches, the iconic Space Shuttle program is coming to an end. In fact, just behind me, a shuttle the astronauts use for training is already being dismantled. America's space program is entering a new era, one of both uncertainty and promise.